Hey, modern world history students. We're continuing with unit number 8, the Second World War, and we're continuing with section number 2, Appeasement and the expansion of Hitler's Third Reich. So in the previous lesson, you learned what appeasement is. It's giving in to the demands of an aggressor in the hope that you can avoid conflict in the short term, but also in the long term. The hope of an appeaser is that eventually the aggressive person who's making all these demands will eventually become satisfied, will essentially run out of demands. That if you keep giving in to the demands of this aggressive person, eventually you will extinguish or satisfy all of those demands, and the demands will go away. And you will have avoided conflict in the short term and in the long term. And so that was the hope of the British and the French in appeasing Adolf Hitler. They were quite concerned about the prospect of igniting a Second World War. They had had a very devastating experience in the First World War. They didn't want to repeat that. And so by appeasing Adolf Hitler, they were hoping to avoid a repeat of the Second World War. A repeat of the First World War. But as we've seen, the lesson that Adolf Hitler did not take from appeasement was to be satisfied. The lesson that he took from it was that he could achieve gains really without any costs. And so rather than appeasement leading to the extinguishing of his demands, the satisfaction of his demands, instead, appeasement led to him making more demands. And so we're going to continue with this idea of how British and French appeasement allowed Adolf Hitler to conquer territories around Germany without fighting a war. You learned about Anschluss in our previous lesson. That was the union or the connection of Austria with Germany, and how that was achieved, without fighting a war. And that was the beginning of the building of Hitler's Third Reich, the Third German Empire. And so today, then, we'll continue to see how he expanded the Third Reich without having to fight a war due to British and French appeasement. So now I'm taking you to the bottom of page 6 in your unit packet. So look, here on the map, we see Germany, and we see Austria, now united as part of the Third Reich because of Anschluss, because the British and French would not, as Hitler said, lift a finger to protect Austria. So after conquering Austria, Adolf Hitler now began to target the other country next door, which was Czechoslovakia. Now, it wasn't all of Czechoslovakia that Hitler claimed to be concerned about, but rather the part of Czechoslovakia which immediately bordered Germany itself. So this portion of Czechoslovakia that I've colored in red here, this part of Czechoslovakia actually had a very large number of Germans living in it, ethnic Germans. This is an area called, by Germans, the Sudetenland. So Sudetenland really in German simply means southern land. So you can see sort of south of Germany, right? South of Germany. And this part of Czechoslovakia was home to around 3 million ethnic Germans. The majority there were Czechs, okay? The majority were Czechs, which is why it was included in Czechoslovakia when Czechoslovakia was created at the end of the First World War. But there was a large minority of Germans, ethnic Germans, again, around 3 million of them living in this area. And so Adolf Hitler now began to demand that they somehow be allowed to separate from Czechoslovakia and join Germany, become part of Germany. So Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland be allowed to separate from Czechoslovakia and become part of Germany. This was in line with the Nazi sort of slogan, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Ein Volk, one nation, ein Reich, one empire, ein Führer, one leader. All Germans, one nation, all Germans should live in the one German empire led by the one German leader, Adolf Hitler. And in this way, Adolf Hitler was sort of correctly tapping into the idea of nationalism, the idea that each nation ought to be ruled by its own people. In the Sudetenland, you had ethnic Germans who were being ruled by Czechs. And so this was a nationalist thing. And Adolf Hitler claimed, really falsely, that the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland were being persecuted, badly treated by the Czech government. It's certainly true that ethnic Germans were not, perhaps, did not have a large amount of representation in the Czech government because they were an ethnic minority. And it's certainly true that at times in history, ethnic minorities who do not have a lot of representation in government can be mistreated. Think about African Americans in our own country and how when African Americans are underrepresented in government, oftentimes they experience mistreatment. Well, Hitler was basically arguing that the Czech government was mistreating and denying the rights of ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland. There's really no evidence that that's true, but it's certainly true that they weren't highly represented in government because they were a minority. So anyway, it was very, very clear that Hitler was prepared to go to war, that he was prepared to send Germany to war over this issue. And he threatened the Czech government, saying that if they did not allow the Sudetenland to become separated from Czechoslovakia, that Germany would have to go and invade Czechoslovakia in order to allow those ethnic Germans to be separated so they could join Germany. So Hitler was very open in declaring that Germany was prepared to go to war over this matter. And that was very alarming to the British and the French because the French had a military alliance with Czechoslovakia. The French were committed to help defend Czechoslovakia in the event that it was invaded. For what it's worth, Czechoslovakia, of all those new countries that were created after World War I, it had probably advanced the farthest along the road that would allow it to defend itself. They had developed a strong industrial economy with a good modern army, and they had built strong border defenses along their border with Germany. They had formed an alliance with the French, and so the Czechs felt that they had stood a fairly good chance with the assistance of France and Britain to stand up to the Germans. And as a matter of fact, once again, Adolf Hitler's generals warned him that in the event that Czechoslovakia had a guarantee of support from France and from Britain, that it would be very, very dangerous for Germany to invade Czechoslovakia, that indeed they did not believe that Germany could win such a war. Nevertheless, Adolf Hitler was threatening war because he perceived that the British and French were so desperate to avoid a war that they perhaps would be willing to give in on his demands once again, that they would be willing to appease him once again. And so his threat of war was real. He fully intended to go to war with Czechoslovakia if Czechoslovakia did not hand over the Sudetenland. But at the same time, he believed probably that just the threat of war would cause France and Britain to cave in and give in to his demands and basically say, you know what, we won't defend Czechoslovakia. We'll let you have the Sudetenland. Either way, the threat of war was alarming. And so the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, so Neville Chamberlain is sort of permanently associated with the concept of appeasement. He is considered to be the architect of appeasement, the chief promoter of the concept of appeasement. Neville Chamberlain, now alarmed by the fact that Hitler was threatening war with Czechoslovakia and that France had a commitment to defend Czechoslovakia and that Britain kind of was on France's side, that this could draw Britain and France into war, he begged for a meeting with Adolf Hitler. And this meeting took place at Munich. So Munich is a city in southern Germany. It's really where everything started for Adolf Hitler. That's where he lived when he joined the Nazi Party. That's where he first attempted to overthrow the government. Of course, that failed. And it was sort of his home base in a way. And so at Munich, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, who was by now a supporter, an ally of Adolf Hitler. This is now 1938, the fall, sort of September of 1938. Hitler and Benito Mussolini met with Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, the president of France. And basically, they were going to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia. They were going to decide whether the Sudetenland remained part of Czechoslovakia or whether Adolf Hitler and the Germans would be allowed to detach it from Czechoslovakia and attach it to Germany. And what's astonishing here is that there were no representatives of Czechoslovakia. The Czech government was not invited to include representatives in this meeting, this conference at Munich, where that country's fate would be determined. Um, and so Hitler was quite a sort of it's unclear whether he lacked any control over his emotions or whether he was simply a really good actor. I think most people think it was the latter, that he was a really good actor. Hitler at the Munich conference raged about the injustices suffered by ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia. It was, as far as anyone can tell, a big lie. But Hitler believed in telling big lies. He believed that you were more likely to get away with a big lie than a little one, because he said everybody tells little lies, so they know how to recognize one. Most people are afraid to try to tell a big lie, so they can't imagine you trying to tell one. And so he raged on this big lie that ethnic Germans were being abused, they're treated unjustly, and he demanded that Czechoslovakia give up the Sudetenland, that Germany be allowed to absorb it in order to protect the rights of the ethnic Germans there. He raged about war, and he insisted that Germany would march now, invade Czechoslovakia now. And it clearly unnerved Neville Chamberlain, a man who was desperate to avoid a conflict leading to war. And then Hitler quieted down, and he offered, having completely visibly shaken Neville Chamberlain, he then made the following offer. He said that if Britain and France would stand down and allow Germany to take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, that he would make this promise, that Germany would have no further territorial ambitions in Europe. That is to say, that if Britain and France sort of did not defend Czechoslovakia, if they stood by and allowed Germany to take the Sudetenland, Germany would make no additional demands for territory. This was the last one. Now, for Neville Chamberlain, these were sort of the magic words, right? The entire strategy of appeasement is to keep giving in to demands until eventually the aggressive person runs out of demands, until eventually the aggressive person is satisfied and stops making demands. And essentially what Adolf Hitler was telling Neville Chamberlain is, congratulations, you've made it. You have reached the point where now I will be satisfied and I will make no further demands for territory. And you can see Neville Chamberlain's reaction. Look at that happy grin on Neville Chamberlain's face. This is the kind of grin that a man makes when he has made a deal with Adolf Hitler. Oh, yes, sir, that is so wonderful. There's Chamberlain on the left, Hitler on the right. And Chamberlain and the French agreed. They said, okay, since you have promised that this will be your last territorial demand, we've achieved our goal. Appeasement has succeeded. You've run out of demands. Since you have agreed that this will be your last demand and promised that, then we will not stand up to defend Czechoslovakia. We will let you take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, which, by the way, would mean also taking all of Czechoslovakia's border defenses, because they were all built in the Sudetenland, leaving Czechoslovakia really with no way to defend itself if Hitler were to decide to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Without partnership from the British and French, without its border defenses, Czechoslovakia had a good army, but not the kind that could defeat Germany. So they knew exactly what they were doing, the British and French, by essentially forcing Czechoslovakia to give up the Sudetenland, by telling the Czechs, we won't stand up for you if you fight Hitler over this. And yet they did it anyway. And so Hitler told the Czechs, you see, the British and French will not protect you. You cannot rely on the British and French. They have abandoned you. And now you will give me the Sudetenland or I will invade Czechoslovakia. And the Czechs realized that really without the support of Britain and France, this would lead to their destruction. And so the Czech government really felt they had no choice but to allow the Germans to move in and take over the Sudetenland and its ethnic German population and its ethnic Czech population, who were there as well, and its border defenses. So the Munich conference was seen by the British and French as a success. They had avoided war in the short term, and they now believed in the long term as well. The Czechs, of course, didn't see it that way. The Czechs, as German forces entered the Sudetenland, they refer to the Munich Conference still today as the Rape of Munich, when the British and French betrayed Czechoslovakia, sold them out, and allowed them to be violated by the Germans. Chamberlain flew back to London, triumphant, cheered by enormous crowds who had been hunkering down and preparing for war. He appeared at London's airport with the document that was signed between himself and Daladier and Hitler and Mussolini, and he waved it to the crowd and said, "I have in my hand the paper that has Herr Hitler's signature on it and mine." And he told the crowd, "It is peace in our time," meaning this document, this agreement that I made, although it cost us, it cost us in terms of our moral standing because we betrayed an ally. It guarantees us peace in our lifetimes. That's what Chamberlain meant when he said it is peace in our time, that there would be no war in their lifetimes because of this dirty deal that he had made with Adolf Hitler, selling out Czechoslovakia. Hitler viewed it very, very differently. Hitler went back to Berlin and spoke to his advisors, and he said, "Our opponents are worms. Worms. I saw them at Munich. Worms lack a spine. Worms are invertebrates. They don't have a spine. They're spineless," right? And that was what Hitler said. That's what Hitler learned from Munich, that the British, led by Chamberlain, rather than standing up for an ally, Czechoslovakia, rather than standing up to Hitler's aggression, backed down like an invertebrate, like someone without a spine. And so Hitler and the German forces entered Czechoslovakia, entered the Sudetenland, took over. And then 6 months later, in March of 1939, from the Sudetenland, operating out of the Sudetenland, the Germans then invaded and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had lost their allies, the British and the French. They had lost their strong border defenses when the British and French essentially forced them to give up the Sudetenland. And so without those things, Czechoslovakia was really vulnerable to invasion by German forces. And in March of 1939, German forces then moving out of the Sudetenland, took over and conquered the rest of Czechoslovakia as well, violating Hitler's promise of having no further territorial ambitions in Europe. That promise lasted for 6 months. So here you see Hitler and his forces entering Prague, which is the capital of Czechoslovakia. So on your map, you can see now here's Germany, here is Austria, this area was the Sudetenland, and here then is the rest of Czechoslovakia, which the Germans took over in March of 1939. Now, for what it's worth, there was one man in Britain who was vehemently opposed to appeasement, and he had been from the very, very beginning. This was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, you remember, had been the First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the British Navy back in World War I. And he had sort of masterminded the Gallipoli campaign that had led in disaster for British, Australian, and New Zealander troops against the Turks. And so he had been forced to resign from that position. He had, however, remained as a member of Britain's parliament. And as Adolf Hitler rose to power, and as he began to rebuild Germany's military, Winston Churchill was really the one lone voice in Parliament who was decrying the appeasement of Adolf Hitler and saying, "You cannot do this. This is a dangerous, dangerous person, and you're allowing him to become more dangerous. Every time you give in to his demands, when you allow him to remilitarize Germany, you make him more dangerous. When you allow him to remilitarize the Rhineland, you make him more dangerous. When you allow him to take over Austria, you make him more dangerous. You must stop this. Appeasement will not lead us to peace. It will only lead us eventually to a more devastating war than what we would get if we stood up to him now." Churchill was desperately trying to get the British government to stand up to Hitler and stop appeasing him. And for this, he had been regarded as a dangerous person himself, a man who would encourage conflict and lead Britain into war. He was seen to be a reckless warmonger. He was called that by his colleagues in the government and in the British press. Following the Munich conference, Churchill said to a friend, "Our government had to choose between a policy of shame and a policy of war." So shame, represented by betraying an ally and selling out Czechoslovakia. War, represented by the prospect of saying no to Hitler with the potential of a conflict leading to war. Our government had to choose between a policy of shame and a policy of war. We have chosen shame, but we will get war too. And of course, he was right. Because Adolf Hitler, as we showed you, proved that his promise not to have any further territorial ambitions had simply lied. He was manipulating Neville Chamberlain, poor little Neville Chamberlain. He was being completely played by Adolf Hitler, and he was. And we saw that 6 months later when Hitler then took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then almost immediately, Hitler began to talk about Poland. Because if you remember, at the end of World War I, when Poland was created, the Allied powers wanted Poland to have a port. And so they took from Germany the port called Danzig, which the Poles call in their language Gdansk. They took from Germany the port of Danzig, which had been Germany's busiest port prior to the war. They took that, and they also took a portion of land right here known as the Danzig Corridor or Polish Corridor, and they gave that to Poland so that Poland would have a port so that they could begin trade and have a modern economy. Of course, there were ethnic Germans living in there. Again, several 100,000 ethnic Germans living in that Danzig corridor or Polish corridor. And Hitler now began to state, he now began to decry that German citizens living in the Polish corridor were also being mistreated, and that they were also being treated unjustly by the Polish government. So it was clear to everybody that Adolf Hitler's next target was Poland. And so, outraged by the fact that he had broken his promise to him, that Hitler had broken his promise to him, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, declared, along with the French, that Britain and France would stand up for Poland. They had failed to stand up for Austria, failed to stand up for Czechoslovakia, but that Britain and France would stand up for Poland, that they would defend Poland's independence and its borders. In other words, they told Adolf Hitler, if you invade Poland, we will go to war. Churchill was astonished. He said, how can we defend Poland? Look at all that stands between us and Poland. Germany stands between us and Poland. How can we defend Poland? And of course, people might say, well, Adolf, but Winston Churchill, isn't this what you want? And Churchill's answer is, yeah, I wanted this 5 years ago. I wanted us to stand up to Hitler 5 years ago, and you guys wouldn't do it. Now, when we have all the disadvantages, now that Hitler is so much stronger than he ever was if we had stood up to him 5 years ago, now's where you want to draw the line? But that is where the British and French decided to draw the line, on Poland. You can imagine, though, that Adolf Hitler was not shaking in his boots at a threat from Britain and France to go to war over Poland. You know, after all, they hadn't stood up to him in any other case. But now he had a bigger problem. In moving eastward, in moving to the east, Adolf Hitler was now treading on territory that was a little more dangerous. He was moving in the direction of the Soviet Union, led by the ruthless Joseph Stalin, a man who was not afraid to go to war, all right? A man who would stand up to Adolf Hitler, a man whose policies had already killed probably 20 million of his own people. So first of all, before moving to the east, Adolf Hitler realized, I need to solidify my alliances. After all, if I were to end up at war with the Soviet Union, I don't want to have to fight on multiple fronts if I can avoid it. And so he, in 1939, solidified his alliance with Italy and Benito Mussolini. And they established what they called the Pact of Steel, an alliance that was unbreakable, just like steel. And this became known later as the Rome-Berlin axis, Rome being the capital of Italy, Berlin being the capital of Germany, an axis being a line connecting them together. And so they referred to the treaty between them, the alliance between them, as either the Pact of Steel or the Rome-Berlin axis. And for this reason, during World War II, Germany, Italy, and then later Japan will be known as the Axis powers. The bigger thing he had to deal with was Stalin, because Poland was territory that was formerly part of Russia, part of the old Russian Empire. And it was known that Joseph Stalin wanted to reconstruct the old Russian Empire if he could. And so in invading Poland, or at least in preparing to invade Poland, Hitler had to admit, I am now moving in a direction. In moving to the east, I'm moving in a direction that might get me into trouble with someone who is a little bit more determined, a little bit more ruthless adversary than poor Neville Chamberlain and the British and the French, right? So Adolf Hitler, he believed much more in the possibility of war with the Soviet Union than with Britain and France. He feared the prospects of war with the Soviet Union, and he believed that Stalin might actually do that. And so he entered into negotiations with Joseph Stalin. Hitler sent his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. You don't need to write that down, I just like saying his name. And he was feeling out the Soviets to see if they would be willing to strike a deal. And as a matter of fact, they were willing to strike a deal. Hitler didn't know this, but Stalin really wasn't fully ready for war with Germany or any other country. He had been trying to rapidly modernize the Soviet Union and prepare it for war. Because remember what he said, we're 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We have to close this gap in 10 years or we'll be crushed. Stalin at this point, August of 1939, didn't really feel that the Soviet Union was ready. Germans didn't know that, but Stalin was more than happy to make a deal that might put off that war. And so the Germans and the Soviets together signed what's called a non-aggression pact, right? And this is known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. A non-aggression pact is not an alliance. This did not commit Germany to fight on the Soviet Union's side in a war, and it did not commit the Soviet Union to fight on Germany's side in a war. It simply meant that they would not go to war with each other. And so this pact was announced to the public, to a shocked British and French, to a shocked Europe in August of 1939. What people didn't know at that time was the secret component of the pact. Secretly, Germany and the Soviet Union had actually already divided up Poland amongst themselves. They had rolled out a map of Poland and they had agreed on a line where Germany would take the western part of Poland, the Soviet Union would take the eastern part of Poland. The fact is that although they had publicly announced simply that they would not fight each other, secretly they had already divided up Poland. And so now that Adolf Hitler was assured that invading Poland would not result in war with the Soviet Union, he was fully prepared to invade Poland. And that invasion began September 1st, 1939. On September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed over the border into Poland. They moved in from the west, out of Germany itself, and they moved in from the south, out of Czechoslovakia. The Polish army really was not a match for the German army in terms of modernization. The German army was really the most modernized army in the world at that time. And you see some elements of the German army invading Poland in the picture here on the left. Tanks, trucks, armored personnel carriers, and overhead, the most modern air force in all of Europe. The Polish army really was not modernized. They were still using weapons dating back to the period right after the First World War. They did not have tanks really to speak of. They did not have truly modern artillery or any kind of anti-tank guns to defend against the German tanks. They were using airplanes that were World War I vintage airplanes, and they moved their artillery around the battlefield still on carts pulled by horses. So the Polish army was simply no match for the Germans. And the reality is that despite Britain and France's promise to defend Poland in the event of a German invasion, as Churchill had pointed out, there was really no way for the British and French to do that, to move their armies in position to help defend the Poles. And so the Poles were in a very difficult position, being invaded by an army which outmatched them really in every way, and with no real hope of help from the British and French. Hitler ignored the fact that the British and French had threatened to go to war with Germany if he invaded Poland. And amazingly, astonishingly, the British and French had said, "This is it. We draw the line here. You have fooled us too many times. You have humiliated us, and we've appeased you too many times. And at Poland, we draw the line." And yet, after Germany invaded Poland, Neville Chamberlain contacted the Germans and basically said, almost like one more round of appeasement. "Now listen, we told you we were going to go to war if you invaded Poland, but now you've invaded Poland, and now we're going to go to war if you're not out of Poland in 24 hours. So like one last chance, ditch effort to avoid a war here, desperate to avoid a war. The British and French gave Hitler 24 hours to end his invasion of Poland. But of course he didn't do that. He wasn't threatened by the British and French anymore. It was too late for them, he would say. And so on September 2nd, 1939, the day after the invasion began, Britain and France did what perhaps Hitler believed they didn't have the nerve to do. They actually did declare war on Germany. And that was the beginning of World War II in Europe, the Second World War in Europe, when Britain and France on September 2nd, 1939, declared war on Germany because of Germany's invasion of Poland. But again, there was no hope for the Poles. The Poles fought valiantly. They fought an incredibly brave defense of their country and actually fought much better than the Germans anticipated and held off the Germans for about 2 weeks. But in September 17th, 1939, the Soviet Union then invaded Poland as well. So in order to claim their share of Poland, which they had negotiated with the Germans, on September 17th, 1939, Soviet forces, a much less modern but a very large army, invaded Poland from the east. And now poor Poland, outmanned, outgunned, was fighting a two-front war, facing the Germans moving in from the west and the south, I guess a three-front war in a way, the Soviets moving in from the east. And at that point, there was no hope. I mean, the Polish resistance, which had fought so hard, so valiantly, did in fact at that time collapse. And within 2 more weeks, Poland was overrun. The Germans taking the western portion, which they had agreed to in their treaty with the Soviets taking the eastern portion, which they had agreed to in that treaty with the Germans. So now war is underway. Britain and France have declared war on Germany, starting in September 1939. However, following the defeat of Poland, Adolf Hitler's generals came back to him and said, "Look, this didn't go as well as we thought it would. I mean, don't get me wrong, we conquered our portion of Poland. We did what we had to do. But they told Hitler the German army did not perform as well as we believed they would. The Poles, given how badly outmanned and outgunned they were able to fight us to a standstill in some areas. And so they told Hitler, we are not really ready to go to war with more powerful countries to our west, like Britain and France. The German military is really not prepared for that. We need more time. We need time to build more aircraft and more tanks and to train more pilots." And Adolf Hitler said, "How long are we talking about here?" And the generals said, 6 months. We need until spring of 1940. And for once in Adolf Hitler's career, he actually listened to his generals. And he said, "Okay, you have 6 months. You have until spring of 1940 to prepare." Now, unfortunately for the British and French, they were equally unprepared to fight the Germans, so they were not able to take advantage of Germany's unpreparedness. And so for a period of 6 months, from October of 1939, October, November, December, January, February, March of 1940, war had been declared, but neither side was really prepared to fight. And so you have what's called in Germany Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. And in Britain, it's called the phony war. A period of 6 months in which both sides have declared war, but neither side is really ready to fight, so there wasn't a lot of activity. That would have to wait until spring of 1940. And we'll get there in our next lesson. So until then, take care of yourselves. Try to be healthy and safe. I'll see you then. Bye-bye, Modern World History.